Hey guys, before we can pour the epoxy, we need to seal the slabs with shellac. Sealing the slabs does two things. First, it prevents the epoxy from being absorbed too much by the wood, and second, it reduces any air in the wood from being released into your epoxy, which would cause unsightly air bubbles. I'm going to be applying this to all sides of the slabs. It is very quick drying, and in about an hour I'll be able to come back and seal the other side. When all sides of the slabs are sealed and the shellac is dry everywhere, I will put the slabs in our mold and I want to secure them in place. They really won't move laterally too much because of the mold, but the epoxy could get under, which would cause them to float, and then our epoxy would not be level at the top of the slabs. I'm just using some scrap 2x4s with a bit of tuck tape on them to prevent sticking. I'll get into more detail on how to calculate the amount of epoxy required in another video, but it's basically figuring out the average width of all the spaces to be filled and using that to calculate the volume. I like to draw a rough sketch and fill in the measurements as I go. So I've calculated the total volume as 5.4 liters, and since I'll be doing this in 2 pours, I'll need 2.7 liters per pour. The ratio of resin to hardener for the epoxy I'm using is 2.7 to 1 in volume. So I will need 730 milliliters of hardener and 1,970 milliliters of resin. I'll be coloring the epoxy with black metallic pigment, but you can use any color you want. I've marked this bucket by using a measuring cup and water to get the exact markings I need. Now I'm going to go ahead and mix up our epoxy. I'm using this flashlight to help show me the level of the resin. It can be very slow pouring, especially as you get to the end of the container. I've seen other people warming it up in a sink full of warm water, but I usually just wait it out. Unfortunately, I lost the video of me pouring the first level of epoxy, but you just want to fill it half full in each cavity. Shortly after, you will see bubbles from mixing start to appear on the surface. You can use a heat gun or hair dryer if you don't have one to get rid of the bubbles. Try not to get too close to the epoxy and don't stay in one spot for too long. You don't want to burn the epoxy. It will mostly be dependent on the ambient temperature that will determine how long until you should do the next pour. But you can check by using a toothpick or a small thin stick to check the thickness of the epoxy. You want it to be about the same consistency as cold honey. I'm going to follow the exact same process as the first pour to mix up our second batch of epoxy. Make sure it is completely mixed and then fill each section up to the top of the slabs. I wasn't too worried about my pouring accuracy because I will ensure that every crack and crevice gets filled using a Bondo scraper. You will see that I did find the mold was not perfectly level, so I ended up putting a small shim under it to stop the epoxy from running to one side. I left this to set for about 3 days before I was ready to break it out from the mold. Remove the straps or whatever you had securing the slabs, and then remove all the screws securing the frame to the bed. Even with the epoxy not sticking to the tuck tape, it can still be a little difficult to break it free from the mold. Just take your time so you don't damage the project. Now that we have the rough epoxy form of our table, we need to go back to the router sled and level it again before we can begin sanding.